Hello and welcome to our most popular webinar, Harmful Traditional Practices, with a focus on some of the different types of harmful practices, the emotional impact it has, and how we direct individuals for support in developing good practice. With over 400 attendees booked, it's going to be an interesting session. This webinar was brought to you by the British Association of Social Workers, Better Lives Foundation, Human Value in Action Foundation. My name is Alimatu Monikeni, and I am a woman and girls' rights advocate, founder of a Sierra Leonean-based online organization, A Girl at a Time, and the ambassador for Better Lives Foundation, Sierra Leone. I will shortly introduce to you our esteemed panel speakers and presenters, but first, what we do know about harmful practice. What we do know about harmful practice is that it consists of a gender-based violence and against women and girls, and increasingly affecting men and boys. Often harmful practices can amount to torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment against a person. Such practices are deeply rooted in discrimination on the basis of sex, gender, age, disability, amongst others. The Committee of Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and Girls, the CEDAW, and the Committee of the Rights of the Child have consistently underlined that harmful practices are deeply rooted in societal attitudes that regard women and girls as inferior to men and boys. Harmful practices violate human rights to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health and can carry a high risk death and disability. For example, FGM. FGM can lead to various and immediate long-term health consequences, including long-term gynecological problems, such as fistula and psychological effects, and leading to death. Another example is child marriages, often unaccompanied by early and frequent pregnancies and childbirth, resulting in higher than average maternity, morbidity, and mortality rates. In 2015, the Partnership to End Harmful Practices set up a consortium, which was made up of 7 women's organizations in Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea, Hammersmith, Fulham, Tower Hamlets, and Waltham Forest. The consortium worked on a 2-year pilot, working on 3 key areas: training for professionals, providing advice and support to practitioners, and delivering engagement activities within communities. In that time, they provided and supported in relation to 218 harmful practices cases. The outline for the session today includes some presentations from our key guest speakers and a plenary session, and hopefully I'll be doing a closing remark at the end. But I urge you to also look at the chat and the information available coming through the chat function. Amongst the topics to be presented today are different types of harmful practices, the impact on individuals' health and well-being, and also I would urge you to also consider buying or looking at the book, the textbook written by Jerry Campbell and Neelam Sakaria, 2 of our key speakers. Law and harmful traditional practices, direct work and development of good practice, and Better Lives Foundation work in Sierra Leone. If time permits, I will direct your questions to our incredible speakers. So I would now like to introduce to you our formidable speakers. They are the best in the country in terms of their expertise, which goes beyond our knowledge, and we are going to learn a lot from them today. I have also had the opportunity to know each one of them and also worked closely with them for many years through our work in combating FGM in the UK and globally. So let's meet our speakers. First, as you can see on the screen, is Neelam Sakaria, a barrister by profession, Vice President for Women Barristers in the UK, an international gender-based violence expert, criminal justice specialist, an executive coach and mentor and author. And we have Jerry Campbell, OBE, former Scotland Yard detective, superintendent, also an author, an advocate for community safety and engagement, security and tackling violence against women and girls. And I believe he's on to becoming a model for hair shampoo soon, but who knows? And then we have Lethan Bartholomew, head of the National FGM Center, a practice development manager, a former senior social care practitioner, and many more. And you'll get to know that very soon. And finally, we have Devi Patel, founder and managing director of Better Lives Foundation, and also a trained general practitioner. Please be advised, a recorded version of the webinar will be available. We will now play 2 sets of video by the BBC highlighting the use of faith, superstition, harmful practices to address mental illness and bad fortune. And I would like to also remind our attendees that some people may find part of the content today very distressing. And if you do, please do talk to someone or seek some help. We will now have Neelam and Jerry Campbell do their presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Alima. And I wanted to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be speaking to the British Association of Social Workers and all of our international delegates who've joined us today, because really social care and social work delegates are a key group who play a very key role when we're trying to address and handle harmful traditional practices. And what I wanted to say is that we should be mindful of why we're holding this event in February as well. I think it's a really significant month because we've just on the 6th of February had the International Day for Zero Tolerance for FGM. And then on the 8th of March, we're due to have International Women's Day. And this month, for delegates who are interested, UNICEF have published a really key report which came out, I think, in the last 3 or 4 days. And what they have done is they've outlined the very key relationship between child marriage and female genital mutilation. And we're going to touch upon some of those themes in a moment. Jerry, did you want to add anything at this stage before I move on?
No, over to you, Neil.
Okay, thank you. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. And when we're looking at the context, Alima kindly referred to the international context in relation to some of the governing international instruments, because we know that when we're talking about harmful traditional practices, they really are a breach of a child's human rights. And when we're talking about the girl child and specific offences in relation to the girl child, the real impact on their bodily integrity and their right to choose. And we do have a UN definition which looks at the violence against women and girls, and the definition clearly details that violence against women means any act of gender-based violence that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to a woman, including threats of such acts, coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private. And the UN definition mentions gender-based violence, and often these terms can be used interchangeably. And when we're looking at gender-based violence against women, it's violence that's directed against a woman because she's a woman, or violence that affects women disproportionately. And that's what we need to remember here. And it can include physical, mental, sexual harm or otherwise. What we must remember, though, is that gender-based violence can impact men as well, and the harmful traditional practices that we're going to talk about. And Alima so powerfully introduced us to faith-based abuse. Now, we've seen from that it's indiscriminate against the girl child and the boy child when you're seeing the operation of kunduku and spirit removal and spirit possession. So, of course, men can be affected, but there are certain types of harmful traditional practices that can affect women disproportionately. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about things like female genital mutilation. And we know that when we talk about forced marriage or child marriage, the disproportionately high number of women and girls are impacted by that too. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, when we're looking at harmful traditional practices, when Jerry and I are training professionals in the UK and internationally, we always seek to identify the link with the theme with honour. And we know that honour cultures and honour is an underpinning theme to harmful traditional practices. There can be a perception that honour is a term that's associated with South Asian communities. And in South Asia, we have the word izzat, for example. If you mention izzat or sharam, these are South Asian terms that a South Asian person would immediately understand. But I think we have to gain a better and deeper understanding of the impact of honour to harmful traditional practices. As professionals in the UK and internationally, you have to understand how honour plays a part in all cultures. In all cultures, you know, for example, in the West, we've had, you know, in Ireland, for example, we had girls who, if they had a child out of marriage or they were under the age of 16, they were immediately sent off to a children's home or detention facility, the equivalent of for young women, where they gave birth and their child was then sent off to America for adoption. We have positive honour codes and negative honour codes, and they're embedded in history. And we talk about this in the book that we've written as well, that when you're talking about honour, look at France, for example, 19th century France. The issues of honour were sorted out by men, and they were sorted out by having a duel. So off they would go early morning. If somebody had dishonoured another, they would go and resolve that dispute. So I think we absolutely have to understand that honour is something that we can all understand as professionals. And what we would usually say to professionals is just think about the positive honour codes or honour codes that operate in the background and the family that you come from. You know, I would share that in my family, it's really important to revere and look after the elderly. I see that as a very positive honour code. In the UK, for example, if you look at the way that members of parliament are named, they always have the title honourable. It will be the Right Honourable Boris Johnson. Honourable will always be included in the title because there's a status associated with honour in positive cultures. So when we're looking at the negative connotation, so as professionals, understand what honour means to you and what it means around you, and then look at the negative connotations. And we know that when we're talking about, for example, honour-based abuse, and whilst we'll touch upon that during today's seminar, but I think that we won't have sufficient time to cover all the aspects of that. But when we're talking about honour-based abuse, it's usually communities and individuals within that community looking at how they can defend the honour of that community and how they can defend belief systems and you know, ideologies which are shared and shared values that are held by that particular community, which means that you remain a member of that community. And often when we're talking about the negative connotations of honour, this results in inequitable treatment of women in the main. Although we do know, as I was saying at the outset, that men are impacted, but what we would say, there is disproportionate impact on women, and men are also impacted. For example, where a young man in a family is unable to come out and tell his family that he's gay, and the abuse that would result and the dishonour to his family that may result from him disclosing or making that disclosure. Thank you. If we can move to the next slide. Okay, so what we're going to touch upon in our talk is to really give you an insight into harmful traditional practices. Alima's powerful videos have already introduced you, as I said, to faith-based abuse. Next slide, please. And when we're looking at harmful traditional practices, these are practices that have been long established within communities over many, many generations, and they're handed down from family to family, from generation to generation. And I think sometimes if we even went to unpick why communities are doing what they do, they would be really difficult. They'd probably have some difficulty in identifying the actual root cause, but they might say, oh, well, my grandmother did it, and my great-grandmother said that we must follow this tradition, or my grandfather was really keen that we maintain this tradition. So they are practices that have remained in families for a number of years and centuries. But what distinguishes a harmful traditional practice are the taboos that surround that. That if you don't follow this and you don't follow this through, then actually something may happen to you, or there's going to be negative connotations, not only for you as an individual, but your family and your community. And as a result, you're going to cause harm to your own family if you don't comply. And just think about the issues regarding the social control that follows through with child marriage. Girls who undergo child marriage, there's a very, very strong link. Read that UNICEF report between child marriage and FGM, and there may be in some countries where one practice predominates the other, and really there's variability about which of those belief systems is the most prevailing. But we've got to remember that when we're looking at communities and we're looking within them, that it's what that community believes is their traditional practice. And the reason why we focus on harmful traditional practices is that we say that those that result in harm to the girl child, the boy child, to women and men are those practices that we seek to change, okay? That we want to change societal behaviour, and in turn, and we'll touch upon law in a moment, but by changing what is acceptable in a society at this moment in time. What we have to remember is that society has control over that. At any moment in time, we can say what we think is acceptable for us. For example, if we look at what happened in China with foot binding, it was acceptable, but because the society themselves actually said, we don't want to follow through this harmful traditional practice, what we're going to do is we're going to stop doing it because of the damage it's causing to our young girls. And I think we just need to recognise that not all traditional practices are harmful. We need to revere and celebrate the traditional practices which are good and really mark out our communities and mark out our traditions. And I always think of Boris Deary, actually, who is an FGM campaigner based in the Netherlands, and she always talks about, we need to ditch, her wording is, we need to ditch the harmful traditional practices and let's celebrate what's really good about our communities and what's really promising. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. And when we're talking about the forms of harmful traditional practices, there are many. We have put together a list for you, but there are many that we haven't got a full insight into. There are some that we know more about than others. For example, in the UK, we know an awful lot about female genital mutilation. We know a lot about forced marriage. We know less about breast dining, for example. But there are a number of forms of harmful traditional practices which the UN agencies are identifying worldwide and which provide us with an insight into community practice. The one common feature is that it's often really difficult to detect because they are governed by the code of conduct and the code of control by communities themselves. So what I was going to do now is hand over to Jerry. Thank you.
Okay, Neelam, thank you. Thank you for that. And I think it's important for us to then identify what marks harmful traditional practices. So why are they different from other forms of violence and abuse? So we'll just move on to the next slide, please. So understanding the similarities and understanding the differences are vitally important. So when we look at harmful traditional, the many multiple forms of harmful practice, then they're premeditated. There's something about the ritual approach and the acceptability of the ritual approach by some community members. So community approval and collusion strikes at the heart of all of these many different forms of harmful practice. And it's that community approval leading to community acceptability, perhaps driven by cultural norms, cultural values, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So Neelam has already touched on the notions of honour, and all communities throughout the world practice an honour code of some description. It's about what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. It's the rules, the laws that people are judged by and are expected to live by. But of course, harmful traditional practices and the culture that perhaps drives these practices is man-made, inverted commas, and therefore can be changed by man. It's something of a paradox crime, or crimes and abuses, because we see it in some types of harmful practice, for example, breast ironing and female genital mutilation, FGM, that female perpetrators, female relatives are the principal perpetrators of the harmful practice. And sometimes we see healthcare professionals being involved as well. And that's with the misguided notion that if, for example, a practice like FGM is undertaken in a medical facility, somehow it's going to be a lot safer. Because medical professionals are undertaking the practice, anesthetics are used, but we've seen time and again in different regions in the world how young girls, primarily young girls, have died in those healthcare settings as well. And so, you know, it's really important that we understand the wider distinction in the practices. Community approval and collusion is one that we need to unravel and understand. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So why are harmful practices performed? And fundamentally, at the heart of this is the different roles of men, women, and children, girls and boys in society. Where men and boys are expected, men and young men are expected to protect and defend the individuals, families, and communities. And women and girls are expected to maintain the honour of themselves, their families, and communities. But principally, what we're talking about here is the fundamental, striking at the heart of this fundamental gender unequal and discriminatory roles, is that women and girls are expected to maintain their honour and their dignity of their behaviour, to maintain their individual honour, that of their family, that of their community. But fundamentally, striking at the heart of this is the control of female sexuality and sexual autonomy for some of those harmful practices, notably FGM and breast ironing. Fundamentally, it's about, when we look at behaviour and conduct, it's about suitability for marriage, a celebration of coming of age, virginity, purity, chastity, and fidelity. And what we absolutely do know is that it affects women and girls from right across many different cultures, ages, social and economic classes as well, and across the different religious religions too. We know that given the gravity and the severity of the violence and abuse, that the types of harmful practices, as helpfully outlined by Neelam, represent some of the severest forms of child abuse. UNICEF's report will talk about the link between FGM and child and early forced marriage, but we know that harmful practices very rarely come as a single form of harmful practice. We very often see it as part of a continuum of violence and abuse. FGM, child and early forced marriage, sexual violence, domestic servitude, human trafficking, domestic abuse, and so it goes on. So we have got to view this from a lens of a continuum of violence and abuse. So let's move on as we talk about the victim's perspective. If you move on to the next slide, please. And the victim's perspective is absolutely fundamental to our work in this arena. No matter where we work in the wider partnership arrangements, charged with the professional and the moral responsibility and duty to prevent and tackle, then we must always revisit the victim's perspective. And as professionals, when we're involved in the work areas for a significantly long period of time, just sometimes we can become desensitized to the very real hurt and pain which is caused. And so sometimes we have got to, as professionals, we have got to recalibrate our thinking and recalibrate our approach. We must never forget about the victim's perspective. And I just take one quote which always resonates with me, and it's a quote by an FGM campaigner in the UK, Ferris Hussein, when she said, "It's more than written words or spoken words. It's far from just an experience. It's a psychological grief and portrayal that repeated in me from a child until this day." Exceptionally powerful words of a victim and a survivor's experience, looking at that much longer term, the much longer term impact of what took place. So we must never forget about the victim's perspective. Now, Elima, in her introduction, helpfully outlined some of those short and medium-term health impacts. You know, the severe, the severe pain, the shock, the hemorrhaging, the ulcerations, septicemia, fever, and then the hemorrhaging, and then on to the much longer-term impacts as well around cysts, abscesses, perhaps for some sexual dysfunction, HIV transmission because of the use of multiple use of bladed articles which are used in either FGM or tribal scarring and other offending. We see significant complications in childbirth. You know, and we look at FGM and child and early forced marriage. So there's significant volumes of children who die during childbirth as well. And then there's significant other significant issues around scar formations, menstrual disorders, and other significant health problems. But significantly, those other health problems relate to mental health and the psychological impact. So next slide, please. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So it's really important that we understand, and for a long time now in the UK, I think we've been slow to, and our wider public authorities have been slow in recognition here around ensuring that a recognition around the psychological impact on victims, and therefore the much longer term healthcare and social care provision of services. Now that is happening now, and it's been happening for a little while now. However, we need to invest our resources and services to that longer term support. And one of those key impacts has been around, and I'm selecting just one aspect here, is post-traumatic stress disorder or chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. And its very real impact on victims, but survivors as well. And so we will look at, we've identified a number of different syndromes, if you want, which are closely associated with that longer term impacts, short, medium, and longer term impacts on victims and survivors, like, for example, rape trauma syndrome, the Stockholm syndrome, learned helplessness, psychological impact on victims and survivors. And you can see a number of different academic studies looking at percentages and so forth, all of which I'm not going to go through point by point now. But the real point is about the very real impact and the lifelong and lasting psychological impact on victims and survivors. And I'll touch on this a bit later on in terms of how that might affect our work as police professionals, law enforcement, social care, and prosecutors, judiciary, and so forth, has a real impact on what we do. I'm just going to hand back to Neelam now, who's going to discuss some aspects of law.
Thank you. And next slide, please. I'm mindful that our time is running tight as well. So what I wanted to do, we can move to the next slide, is just to give the attendees an insight into the framework that we actually have in the UK. We have legislation which addresses, for example, female genital mutilation, which was amended in 2015. So we do have an FGM Act. We've also got legislation that deals with forced marriage. So we criminalised forced marriage in the UK, came into force June 2014. We've got protection orders to protect women and girls who've been subjected to a forced marriage or FGM. And I think really the key issue regarding these protection orders is that the applications are made in the family court. So in the UK, and there may well be similar experiences with yourselves worldwide, if you're using something similar like a protection order, in the UK, we have the family court, the civil court, working hand in hand with the criminal court. So you might have a criminal prosecution for the offence, but you'll have protection orders applied for in the courts, in the family courts in particular. We've got new provisions in relation to victim anonymity to protect the identity of the victim of a female genital mutilation or forced marriage. So once they make a report to the police, their identity is protected for the duration of the case. And we've also extended our legislation really to make sure that those who have perceived temporary status in the UK, i.e. that they don't have British citizenship, but they are living in the UK, that they're given the protection of the law and the legislation. Now, I've given you a very quick, very, very high level overview of that. But we do know that 28 Too Many, a great charity in the UK, have undertaken a tremendous amount of research across Africa. And what they have done is that they've put together in-country profiles of the laws that are available in a number of different African countries. What I would say is that the law is a really important tool, because I always ask myself and I ask professionals, what do you think is the role of law in society? Okay, the role of law in society is to change behaviour, and that's why we have new pieces of legislation introduced. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, and these are the provisions. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but just outlining the protection that's offered with the new legislation that was introduced. Alima and many of the people who are here today, Jerry and myself, we worked together with government to bring about the change and the introduction of the Serious Crime Act in the UK. And this brought about changes in relation to the way that we handle FGM. And I think the most pertinent point that I'd like to draw to your attention is the final square in relation to mandatory reporting. And in the UK, health, education and social care professionals are required to report to the police where a girl under the age of 16 actually discloses to them, or that they see that that girl has undergone FGM. They've got a duty to report that to the police within 1 month, and this applies to girls under the age of 18. And it may well be that other countries worldwide have a working towards a similar provision, and it's had its challenges in the UK. Lots of debate about the removal, but we always felt that this provision was really key and needed to be introduced, partly because of the perception that social care professionals had of FGM. It was often viewed as not necessarily child abuse. So anyway, a quick canter through the Serious Crime Act for you. So moving to the next slide. Okay, again, that details for professionals the way that the mandatory reporting to police operates in the UK. So what I was going to do now is hand back to Jerry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just move on to the next slide, please. And when we talk about harmful practices, violence and abuse, we cannot not cover the law. We cannot not talk about the police response. But it's a police response in the context with other key instrumental partners. Okay, next slide, please. So the National Police Chiefs Council in covering England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, providing advice and guidance to 43 police forces, 128,000 frontline police officers. 4 key pillars of activity being undertaken around prevention, protection, pursuing offenders, and the preparation, the training and preparation, giving confidence to frontline police officers about what to do and what not to do, and the support that they need to act. But of course, fundamentally, a significant part of their strategy and the partnership approach has got to be about prevention. Has got to be about raising awareness with affected communities and the wider communities. Raising awareness around with the frontline professionals, because it is about giving communities, wider communities and professionals the confidence to do something, to recognize the signs, the symptoms, the red flags, and to do something. Because once we start talking about prosecution and arrests, important as they are, it means that a child or an adult has already undergone serious forms of violence and abuse. So fundamentally, our work has got to be about prevention and protection, i.e. safeguarding. Absolutely fundamental. Okay, let's move on, please, to the next slide. But of course, can you move on to the next slide, please? But of course, there can be some barriers to reporting harmful practices. We, as in all of us on the webinar, we're charged with the responsibility of working with communities to identify how we can overcome these barriers. I've already touched on the point that harmful practices rarely come as a singular act. The point around, and I featured on community acceptance, collusion and support, is a fundamental aspect. It prevents victims and witnesses from within affected communities from coming forward. How do we break down those barriers? Immigration status must never be a reason for a victim not feeling confident to come forward and to receive the right support, the right specialist support that prevents those that preserves life and looks after safety now, and looks after longer term psychological impact as well. Threats, spells, myths, voodoo are a very real impact on victims coming forward. Child abuse linked to faith and belief. We see this with trafficked victims who are trafficked into the UK and across the UK, and for that matter, out of the UK as well. It's a very real issue, and we need to thoroughly educate our frontline professionals to understand that threats, spells, myths, and voodoo are a very real thing happening in the UK today, and happening in many cities throughout the world. We might have time to talk about the first conviction in the UK and how the issue of witchcraft had a presence in that first conviction. Okay, let's move on, please. To the next slide, please. I touched earlier on the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, that's a very real impact for victims and survivors of harmful practices. And of course, it resonates very much in the services that are provided in an investigative environment, because people that are suffering from PTSD, and generally speaking, it's said that the symptoms first develop in the first month of the event, but can then be delayed for months and years later. And of course, victims and survivors will present, and the symptoms will present in different ways. But the recall of events will also be impacted by the PTSD as well. They will have different memories. They will recall different things at different times. Now, whilst what they're saying and everything pieced together as a jigsaw is what happened to them, it was their very real lived experience. But the perception of, for example, police officers, investigators, social workers, prosecutors, the impact of their assessments is absolutely fundamental as well. Checking the veracity, the truthfulness, the credibility of the complainant and witness. So it's absolutely essential that frontline professionals and prosecutors understand the very real impact of PTSD and its impact on recall and recollection of events. We've got a few minutes left, and we just wanted to highlight this particular publication, which has been published in the last couple of weeks. Neelam and I have been working with a number of other professionals from different backgrounds and disciplines on this UN handbook, working with UN Women. Neelam and I do some advisory work there, and UNODC on gender responsiveness. So if you just move on to the next slide, please. So we've been working with the UN on the development of this handbook on gender responsive police services to women and girls who are subjected to violence. Now, what we can say, really informative document, which is it's got practical peer-to-peer guidance, primarily for police officers about the effective investigation and response to a gender-sensitive response to violence and abuse. But fundamentally, the learning and the principles in this particular document, we think, are equally applicable across public authorities. And the real value of the handbook is it contains peer-to-peer guidance, but also complements the many other global and in-country specific training and support mechanisms as well. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. So we recommend that particular product to you, and the hyperlink, there is a hyperlink that mentions it as well. Is prosecution the only solution? Well, you've got a former senior prosecutor, and myself as a former senior police officer and investigator, talking about prosecution, talking about arrests and prosecutions. Is it the only way forward? Well, substantially from our experience is that we know that whilst arrests and prosecutions are fundamentally important, no number of arrests, no number of prosecutions by themselves are going to eradicate harmful traditional practices in the short to longer term. And you can see some key quotes there from a senior family court judge, the lead of the family division of the High Court, and the senior police officer in the UK leading this work. And it's you can see it on your screen, and I'm not going to go through it word by word. But substantially, prosecutions, arrests, whilst they're very important, are not going to eradicate harmful practices. Move on to the next slide, please. Neelam and I are very keen proponents, given what I've just said and what we have said throughout the webinar, is that community-driven solutions are absolutely fundamental to lasting change. Given the cultural drivers and the community values and norms within practicing communities, it is absolutely fundamental that as collegiate partnerships that we work hand in glove with communities. Communities have got to want to change. We have seen many exceptional examples of this throughout the globe, of communities working together and changing and driving practices. Men and women coming together to drive change. Men are substantial parts of the problem of driving different forms of gender-based violence and abuse. They are also got a significant contributory factor in prevention and changing practice to the longer term. What community-driven solutions is not, it's not about mediation. It's not about accessing communities and community leaders through gatekeepers. It's not about the paralegal systems of, for example, Beth Din and Sharia courts, because they're primarily, but not exclusively, but they're primarily controlled by men. This is a real drive from within communities. Move on to the next slide, please, which just outlines some of the key challenges to public authorities. And you know, this is where we would reach out to the leaders, those in leadership positions on the webinar, you know, to look at the wider issues around attitude, aptitude, the appetite for change and drive and to make a difference, to making sure staff have got the right knowledge, skills and experience, to believe the unbelievable, because many of the harmful practices that we have outlined, including witchcraft, the use of spells and voodoo, are happening in our towns, cities, and our estates in the UK today. So it's about believing the unbelievable. Next slide, please. And I'm just about to finish off. So the partnership, that collective partnership is absolutely vital to that support for lasting change. The piece around the contribution to the community-driven solutions. Communities and frontline NGOs and civil society organisations are a really essential part of, and the building blocks, the foundations of, as we move through those foundations to justice, they're really fundamental to achieving justice. Now, what is justice? Justice is that which is associated with what are the expectations? What does the victim and the survivor want to achieve from the intervention of social care and investigators and prosecutors? So, what does justice look like for victims? What does justice look like for the many women, girls, boys, and men within affected communities as well? Next slide, please. And this is just our contact details, just in case anybody has got any follow-up following today's session, because you'll recognise that we have had to keep on time to canter through the presentation. Neelam, is there anything that you just want to briefly add?
Only to say that you know, Jerry referred to the former president of the family division, and that's Sir James Mumby. We can make sure that you have a copy of the judgment in the case of B&G, which is of real help, I think, to social care professionals, both internationally and domestically, because it outlines the importance, for example, for the search of experts when you're bringing cases to court, and it sort of sets out how the court used the World Health Organization definition of FGM, because in the UK we don't have the different types of legislation, different types of FGM stated in our legislation. But thank you, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Yeah, so
Thanks.
thank you.
Back.
Thank you for your participation today. Many thanks to the British Association of Social Workers and the Better Lives Foundation as well. Alima, back to you.
Thank you so much to Neelam and Jerry. What a brilliant presentation that was. But we're running a bit now, so we're going to go over to our next presenter, who's Lethan Bartholomew, and he's going to look at some direct work and some good practice for social care providers. Over to you, Lethan. Would you like to unmute, Lethan?
Thanks, Alima. I was just saying, thanks a lot for inviting me to deliver a presentation, particularly the FGM Center. Because as a social worker, when I was in frontline practice, harmful practices is something that I never received training on. I can stand here looking back on my frontline practice and thinking about cases where it strikes me now that it's probably an issue that that a parent or a child and young person was experiencing, and I never actually really explored it because I just didn't have the knowledge. So it was a case of not knowing what you don't know. So if we can start off by moving on to the next slide, please. Next. Right, I've been asked to focus on these 2 points. First one is looking at direct work and developing good practice, and then available support and networks within the UK. Next slide. At the FGM Center, this is the model that we work towards. So when we're working in a local authority where we place social workers, we ensure that we engage with communities to raise awareness. We also focus on professional development, and we have on our website, there is a knowledge hub that acts as a repository for all research data, tools and resources that professionals can use. We particularly focus on social care professionals. Next slide. Right, I just wanted to reinforce what Neelam said in describing what is harmful practices. But what I wanted to help us to understand is that when we're talking about harmful practices, yes, they are traditional harmful practices, but they're also re-emerging and emerging practices. One of the important things to start off to think about it is that when we hear the term traditional, we have a tendency to focus on only certain groups. So we think about sub-Saharan Africa, probably the Middle East, South America, and other parts of the world. And we don't think about these practices actually happening here in Europe and in the UK. And so one of the most important points that I want you to remember is that when we talk about harmful practices, no one group holds a monopoly on it. We saw the video that was started off, and it's people from a Black or Asian background, and even with that issue, it's very much an international issue. So the starting point is not to think about it as being a Black, Asian, or American ethnic issue. So next slide. Now, one of the books or authors that actually helped me to understand the whole issue of harmful practices, it was written by someone called Sheila Jeffries, who's an academic from Australia. What she was saying was that there's a lot of contradictions when it comes to the whole issue around harmful practices, because as I said, we think it only happens within certain groups. And she went on to explain, this was back in 2012, that that for harmful practices that happen here in the West, and the contradiction is that because we label it under the heading of it being choice or medicine or even fashion, we don't think that is actually harmful at all. So it then creates an illusion of acceptability. So as a frontline practitioner, one of the things that you will have to deal with is when working with a family who will raise some of these contradictions and challenge your position that what they're actually doing is harmful. So in her book, you can actually Google it and download a free copy of it. She talks about, other forms of practices that happens here in the West, that they are equally as harmful. The word tradition isn't added to it, but we don't label it as such. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. All right, just under this entire issue, what I want to add before we go on is that to the next slide is Eileen Monroe. People would know that she reviewed the child protection system back in 2012-13, and she wrote a book that's called Effective Child Protection. And what she was saying was that the whole idea of child abuse, it's very much contested. She said that child abuse, we define child abuse as something that's harmful or morally wrong. But there are some practices, for example, under the cloak of religion, like male circumcision, that causes injury to a child, but it's defended on certain groups. For example, some people say that spanking should be accepted, and others say that no, it's unacceptable. And then she goes on to talk about the whole definition of abuse. She says that it embodies beliefs about what child-rearing behavior is acceptable and which ones are dangerous, and about values that people hold. So, for example, the relative rights of adult versus a child, and the values of males and females. She goes on to give examples of harmful practices, and she says like child labor, dowry, child marriage, and institutional care, that all of these are considered to be harmful. Over time, it has changed. Some people still hold to the belief that it isn't harmful. But one of the main things, the conclusion that she arrived at, is that this whole concept of what is child abuse it's ambiguous, it's contested, and she said it's also shifting. It's problematic. Even when there is consensus, it's problematic. And one of the things around harmful practices that we talk about is that we talk about it within the context that, yes, it is child abuse. We have, Neelam went through the laws that are associated with, and Jerry spoke about the emotional impact and burdens of it. But there's still professionals who will hold the view that some harmful practices are not harmful at all. So we never talk about harmful practices within the context of professionals who hold the same belief system. So based on that video that Alima showed when we started off, some people would ask the question, so what is harmful about that? What is harmful about someone believing that they are affected by jinns or evil spirit and going to a religious leader to be prayed for? Because people have a right to practice, their faith, their belief, they have a right to conscience, and who are we to question it? And it becomes very difficult when we ourselves hold those belief systems as well. So all of these things play a part in how we intervene as professionals. It will affect the quality of our assessments and the outcome of the assessments that we undertake. So one of the core things really is about cultural competence as a starting point. Now, it's a very much contested concept, cultural competence, but it's banded around. But what I like about it is that cultural competence, it's really about organizational behavior. Yes, as practitioners, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're able to practice in a right way that takes into considerations the child's world, people's entire identity. But if you get training on these different topics that we're talking about and go back into an organization that is not culturally competent, you'll be stagnated in what you are able to do. You become immobilized. So cultural competence is really about organizational behavior. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Right, this is just another definition that broadens it out and give 5 examples of what cultural competence is really about. So yes, I wouldn't go through all of them, but it's about valuing diversity, having the capacity for cultural assessment, being able to adapt your service, having that institutionalized culture and knowledge, but also be conscious of the dynamics inherent in culture when cultures interact. Now, why I say, why cultural competence is really important, but as I said, it's still contested, and I'll talk about that just now, is that yes, it's rooted as professionals of us putting ourselves in a child's shoes, or survivor or victim's shoes. It's about viewing the world through their lens. It's about acquiring that repertoire of knowledge and skills, but knowing that we are limited in what we are able to know as humans. It's about unpacking culture. It's using it as a stepping stone to be able to understand other cultures. But it also helps us to assess what is cultural, what is abusive, and what is neglectful, or a combination of these three. And also it helps us, it allows us to develop a balanced understanding of what is ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. Next slide. But having said that, cultural competence really, when we talk about it, why it's considered to be a contested term is that there's also, you know, that there's cultural competence, but there's also cultural incompetence as well. So it's about believing that cultures are expressed in the same way by a group, because there's a lot of variability within groups when it comes to culture. It's about taking a stance that your culture is best, and that is results in discrimination and oppression of others. It's about understanding that culture and ethnicity does not match, it's not the same thing. It's about matching service users. So because you think that the service user is from, for example, Sierra Leone, you allocate a worker from Sierra Leone, and not understanding that within cultures there are also conflict and there's difference. And also only using a parent as a marker to determine cultural background. And one of the main things as well is that I wouldn't, because of time, it's about not making a service user feel culturally safe. Next slide. But when we talk about cultural competence, Dogra, who's a psychiatrist and also an anthropologist, she came up with this other view of cultural competence. She said it's more about cultural sensitivity, because we can never actually know our own culture. So why would we expect people to know everything about someone else's culture? So it's not really about acquiring expertise about others, but it's really about recognizing that we need to be aware of our own perspectives. So our starting point is ourselves, and then how they reflect our ability to be open to the perspective of others. So I would say it's a combination of cultural competence and cultural sensibility. Next slide. Now, why cultural competence is contested? Next slide, please. Okay, no, I think you're going in the wrong direction. So it should say, okay, great, thanks. So cultural competence, why it's actually contested, is that, as I said, we can never know everything about someone's culture. It's about being reflective, yes, that's cultural competence, but as humans, we can never fully be 100% reflective. So we're always starting from a base of never being 100%, because cultural competence is a process of becoming. We actually never arrive as practitioners or as humans. So we must have that understand that our self-awareness is limited. Now, the whole idea of cultural competence just create an othering. So it's about, one of the main things is that when I first came to this country, I worked as a probation officer, and I was told that, you know, I had to understand, you know, the culture of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. But no one ever thought that I needed to understand the culture of white British people. So cultural competence starts off on a base about it's othering other groups, as opposed to thinking about everyone has culture. So we need to understand, develop that understanding of everyone, because as I said a bit earlier on, when we talk about harmful practices, it's not about others, it's about all of us, because we all societies practice some form of harmful practice. And so leading on from that, the whole idea of it being, it's a new form of racism that can develop this whole idea around cultural competence. So next slide. Now, so as a practitioner, you know, having said, you know, all of that, it's really about understanding difference. So its starting point is to understand these differences. So understanding the whole concept as well around, as Neela mentioned, about you know, what is honor-based abuse, because as a leading root cause or driver for harmful practices, understanding patriarchy, understanding that how it would manifest itself in different groups. understanding the meaning of these things. So one of the key things that Neelam said as well is that that word Izzat or Haram, for example, it means something to, it automatically means something to certain groups, and is about understanding the meaning of these things for people, the effects that they will have on people's lives. And also it's about understanding that these differences, their patterns of differences of disadvantage and discrimination and oppression, how it manifests itself. But I have here as a title, Working with Difference, but also remember there could be professionals who have the same belief system. So it's not only working with difference, but it's working with people who believe that a harmful practice is not harmful. Next slide. This is a good gauge to help us to understand around how harmful practices manifest itself and how to approach it. So there are some practices, yes, they are harmful. There's some that are potentially harmful. There's some that's neutral. And then there's some practices that are beneficial. Now, as a practitioner, you use your understanding of child development. You use the law, you use your understanding of people, what is the meaning of these things for people. And then you start to make that decision of where does it fall within this continuum. But it's not an easy task because, as I said, it involves you surfacing some of your prejudice and perhaps what we call unconscious bias as well. So next slide. So just thinking about resources. So on the National FGM Center website, we try to develop resources and tools for frontline practitioners, and these are just some of them. In your handouts, you will see that there's a best practice guide that's provided to you as well. So on our Fgm Assessment Tool, if you are undertaking an assessment, you can use our Fgm Assessment Tool to help you to understand risk. It doesn't suspend professional judgment. It just gives you aids your assessment and help you to ask the right questions, and you input the data, and at the end it runs off a report and tells you, gives you some indication of the level of risk and where else to focus on. We have a direct toolkit on FGM, so if you're undertaking direct work with children and young people and parents and carers, there are a number of exercises that you can use to undertake that direct work. When looking at faith and belief, so the far end of child abuse linked to faith and belief looks at witchcraft and spirit possession, but the main thing is, as practitioners, exploring faith and belief is a key thing that you should be doing anyway at the starting point of the work, any work on any issue you're doing with families. So this guide, it helps you to explore how to ask the right questions with regard to faith and belief. And then there is actually a question guide for social workers specifically focused on the, abuse linked to faith and belief. We have the language guide on abuse linked to faith and belief and FGM as well. And we have a number of infographics and posters to help increase your knowledge around different forms of harmful practices. Right, just thinking about, continuing about support. On many times when we talk about harmful practices, we talk about them in isolation of each other. But it's important to know that this whole theme of polyvictimization is part of the lived experience of survivors. So you would have that a woman or a girl would experience FGM, and there's research that shows that a survivor of FGM is 3 times more likely to experience interpersonal violence. So you just imagine that there's 200 million women and girls in this world living with the consequences of FGM. When we think about early marriage or forced marriage, is 700 million survivors. Many of the girls who have been cut would also have experienced some form of probably early marriage or forced marriage or some other form of harmful practices. So and also probably domestic abuse. But so polyvictimization is a key thing. So when working on the issue of domestic abuse and you're working with a woman who comes from an FGM affected community, it's really important in the work that you're doing to ask questions around FGM. or even if it's forced marriage or early marriage, ask questions about other forms of harmful practice as well. So it's important not to view it as a silo. Explore other forms of harmful practices. I was really glad to see that Jerry touched about PTSD. But trauma is one of those key things that you have to explore across the board with different forms of harmful practices, and particularly have an understanding of what is developmental trauma and how that manifests itself within the lives of women and, well, girls from a very young age, because it's, if you think about it, as an adverse childhood experience. It's probably the first one that they would experience, and that charts the course or as a trajectory towards other forms of trauma, because there are just several different types of trauma, not only PTSD. Right. So just thinking about good, good practice. So I went on talking and I did tell you to change the slide. So if you can move on, next slide. Next slide. Yep, so this was one on developmental trauma. If you can move on, the next slide, please. Right, so just rounding off, I think I only have 1 more minute. So just thinking about good practice. So we talk about support networks. There aren't many support networks out there. It's very much left to to grassroots organizations. For example, Forward. It's one that's based in London. I know that Alima, over the years, several years ago, we worked together on based in Newham, the one-stop shop, supporting women in Newham who became champions, who were supporting other survivors as well. And that was key work. We have we don't really have specialized shelters for harmful practices, but we have specialized shelters obviously for domestic abuse, and they will support women who are also survivors of other forms of harmful practices. We know that there is the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, and also Connotations runs the Honor Network Helpline as well. They're doing really important work. It's a fantastic organization as well, Connotations. We have a number of Fgm clinics across the UK. So if you Google Fgm resource pack, it's developed by the Home Office. It's like the A to Z for Fgm, and you can find number of services across the UK that offer support to women and girls. We only have one specialized Fgm clinic here in the UK, and that's based at University College London. That's led by Dr. Deborah Hodes. So I would tell you to Google it. They have a very friendly team there. They also have a play therapist who will be able to support children and young people who attend that clinic. We have also the Dahlia Project, which is the only one of its kind in the UK that offers psychotherapy and group work specifically for women who are survivors of FGM. I know that they as well have a number of cases of women with breast flattening who are also FGM survivors, and they're supporting, providing support for them as well. One of the key things really is about how do we change cultural norms, because harmful practices are really about cultural norms, and how we could engage with communities to continue to raise awareness, but also just to round off, that multi-agency approach. It's key because it's about providing that holistic understanding of how to support women and girls who are affected by harmful practices. And how I would like to end, it's on this last slide, and some of you may have actually seen this before, but if you can move on to the last slide. And I'll tell you what the answer is when you take 30 seconds to read it. So a man and his son were in a car accident. That's the first image. The second image is the man died, and on the way to the hospital, but the boy was rushed into surgery. The last image says, the surgeon said, "I can't operate, for that's my son." So the question is, who is this? Who said that? Who's the surgeon? I'm going to put you on the spot, Alima. Who is the surgeon? Say that again. You're on mute.
The mother?
Yes, so it is the mother's decision. You'll be surprised at how many people get this wrong, and they try to but the key thing is that the reason why they get it wrong is because it's about unconscious bias. That people don't think that women could be doctors in the first place, so they never arrive at that answer. And when we're thinking about harmful practices, how I want to end is to help us to understand is that we can also, as professionals, we are humans, we suffer from unconscious bias as well. And in the work that we're doing around, as Neelam started off talking about what is violence against women and girls and gender-based violence, is that in our practice we could sometimes take an approach that is very paternalistic and and blame women for what has happened to them, or place them in a situation where they are criticized because their child is at risk of FGM or other harmful practices. And one of the key things to remember is that patriarchy is the main driver for this, and women are just doing the bidding for men. And so when we talk about harmful practices, it's really important to focus on women, on men as well, because they play a key part in perpetuating harmful practices, while either directly or indirectly. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Lethan. That was very incredible. And yes, going on to Devi Patel now. And Devi's going to cover where I was actually born, a district in Sierra Leone. And believe it or not, a lot of the victims of harmful practices in that region, though we're women, but a lot were also men. Over to you, Devi.
Thank you, Alima, and thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful sitting here listening to everybody's speeches. And now I will cover a practical approach to Better Lives Foundation and also the harmful practices that go on and that we see in our hospital. So can I have the next slide, please? So our work takes us to Sierra Leone in an area called Yonibana, which, like Alima said, it's in the Tonkolili district. And in Sierra Leone, we went there 13 years ago. We started to deliver free medical treatment within the community there and built a hospital in the Tonkolili district. We are the only free hospital in the country, and we offer services to all users, not only children, but adults and all ailments as well. We deal a lot with a lot of the harmful practices that go on in the area, and in fact, one of the traditional FGM center is only about half a mile away from our hospital. So we see a lot of atrocities that come into the hospital day in, day out. We are a referral hospital to 36 government PHUs. So PHUs are the peripheral health units within our district, within our chiefdom, which is the Yoni chiefdom. And we also treat patients and see people from around 360 other villages which surround our hospital. Our focus is, if you go on to the next slide, please. Our focus is in Medicare, in social care, educare, and agriculture, because without these four aspects, a person cannot survive in life. So within the educare and agricare, we have, what we've done is we've sponsored 75 students from secondary level all the way through to postgraduate. And our dedicated agricare team, which is also in place, they work very tirelessly in introducing different varieties of crops and add to the agriculture biodiversity of the region. Our first harvest, in fact, took place in 2019. Next slide, please. In Medicare and social care, apart from all the other ailments that we treat, we see a lot of men and women, children coming in to the hospital, who have undergone through traditional harmful practices in all kinds of things that go on. And a lot of the girls, are survivors of FGM, but also other things as well. We have workshops that we run for underage and forced marriages. underage pregnancies. In fact, 86% of women and girls in Sierra Leone are cut already. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to highlight a case study that we have of Fatima's story. But before I do that, these women that come to see us or even other cases, sadly, they don't come to us immediately after injury. So the mutilation to the sexual organs and deformity in young children translates to more complexity in adulthood, and these individuals are thrown out of society like lepers. I think Alima did mention earlier on that there might be some aspects of what you hear and what you've seen already and heard that might be a little bit upsetting. If this is the case and you do feel that you need to step away or not listen, do so. If you need any help later on to understand or you want to talk further, you're most welcome to email us on info@betterlifesfoundation.org. All the social workers have got a support system in place, all the members of the BASWA as well. So I'd like to go into Fatima's story. Now, Fatima first came to Unibana Hospital in 2012, and she came to see our gynecology nurse specialist, Anne. Fatima, on appearance, seemed very and also very anxious. There was a distinct smell of urine when she entered the room. Her command of English, however, was very good, so we could understand what her concerns were. As a young girl, when she was about 12 years old, she underwent FGM in preparation for her to be married to an older man who lived in a village not so far away from her own home. Following this procedure, she suffered greatly with vaginal bleeding, infection, psychological damage, and so on. Now, she felt very betrayed by her mother for putting her through this. However, her mother at this age informed her that this was normal practice for girls and just brushed it off. Following her marriage a few years later to this older man, she experienced terrible pain during her intercourse, suffered infections all the time. Soon after her marriage, she became pregnant and continued with the urinary infections. She went into labor, and eventually, after laboring for about 2 days, she had a daughter, but died soon after delivery due to the complications of FGM that she had earlier on. Following her delivery, she developed a retrovaginal fistula. The doctor at the hospital informed her that it was down to the scarring following the FGM. She then became double incontinent of feces and urine. On returning home to her husband, there was no good news for her. The news was worse. She was informed by him that she was dirty, and he banished her from the house. Her own family also rejected her, apart from an uncle. Eventually, she underwent surgery and now has a colostomy bag. Her life has completely changed. Most people ostracize her as they feel she has brought shame to the family. She has difficulty finding work and relies on handouts. This is where Lethan's talk came on cultural practices. Something like this that was done to a child, and then she's ostracized by all the community and also by the family. She has no colostomy bags, and she has made bags to collect feces from black bin liners, which are then attached to an elastic band to the stoma. She remains incontinent of urine and has to wear rags to stop her leaking down her legs. To date, she continues to live as best as she can. On examination, inside her vagina was appalling, as was the violation to her genitalia. She received some stoma products from our hospital and advised on pelvic floor exercises. She's a regular patient at our hospital, and unfortunately, there has been no change in her life. In fact, her urinary incontinence has got worse. At Yoni Banasai Hospital, most of the women we looked after have experienced FGM. Some of the younger women say that they will not implement this practice on their daughters. Even after education, it is very hard to beat these cultural practices. In fact, talking to one of our male employees, I found out that his grandmother insisted that when he gets married, he should be married to a girl who has been cut. And after talking to him several times, I asked him that why is this important, and what difference does it make if she has gone through the initiations or not? And his answer was that my grandmother said that if she's gone through the initiations, then she's clean. If she hasn't, then it means that she's unclean. So I said, yes, but what does this mean? And what his answer was that if she's gone through the initiation, then it will mean that she will be at home and will not go to other people for sexual pleasures. In fact, she will, be at home and just be there just for him. So I said, well, what does that mean for you? And he was very much like, well, I can go, and find other women. So it was very much a biased thing. So in fact, it got me thinking, and then we talked to more and more elderly ladies and gentlemen in the villages, and we found out that it had more to do with the daughter-in-laws not being promiscuous, and therefore they wanted their daughter-in-laws to have been cut, just so that it was sort of an oppression that they could have their daughter-in-laws in the house, because the girls, as Jerry said earlier, suffered from a lot of PTSD, and therefore they felt unclean, they felt incomplete, and so on. And I asked him, our employee, what will happen if you have a daughter? Would you do the same thing to her? And he had to think about this. And then eventually he came up with, no, I don't think I would do something like that to her. So I asked him, well, in that case, why do you want to marry a girl only if she has gone through the education? And I said to him, think about this, go and talk to your brother, and then you talk to me. If this is your place on this is your stance on this, then we really have to think about, whether or not we talk to people coming to the hospital or not. After 2 days, he came to see me, and he in fact said that he'd had a very long talk with his grandmother, and they came to the conclusion that women should not be cut, and that he would be happy to be married to a girl who has not gone through the initiation, which was very refreshing to hear from him. And as such, we've had several conversations and also workshops that we run with all our employees at the hospital, just on all these issues as they go out into the community and they go out talking to the community. A lot of awareness and so on has been going on. We have community champions who also go out and try to eradicate or try to educate people, women, and especially children at schools, just so that we can have less of these practices going on and more of them going and talking to their elders who are performing these atrocities. So our focus at Better Lives Foundation is very much with immediate effects on patients that come in, longer term implications, and psychological impact. Can we go to the next slide, please? So with the immediate effects, as you can read, there are several different things that go on. Severe pain, shock, bleeding, and infections. Infections come in all the time, and we're continuously dealing with these, as when they are cut, when they go through some of these practices, especially with FGM, the instruments that are used are not cleaned. And so we have to work a lot with infections that happen and that we have to be seen in the hospital. Here, I'd like to talk about one of our nurses who works at the hospital. We sponsored her from secondary level through to graduate. She qualified as a nurse, and when we started working with patients and started working with FGM, she actually broke down. And we were having a group session at that time with all the employees in the hospital. We have about 39 staff, and 13 of them are female. And just the body language straight away when we were talking to all our female, all our employees at that time, all the staff, the body language alone kind of told us that all these girls have gone through some form of harmful practice during her life. And one of our nurses, who's quite verbal, she was happy to share her account. And that was that when she was about 8 years old, her mother took her to get initiated. And of course, she didn't know anything about it. And she wasn't told anything except there was going to be a big party going on, lots of dancing and lots of music. She was dressed up nicely, and she was taken to her village. And it was her aunt, in fact, who performed the FGM. She was all of a sudden taken into another room, into a hut, into another room by herself. Her mother had to wait outside, and 4 men came in and they took her because she was quite strong and pinned her down. And then they went out, the women were there, and they pinned her down, they blindfolded her, and her aunt, who was performing the FGM, carried on, and she cut her. And because, she was because our nurse was quite strong and so on, it took several women to hold her down, to pin her down. Now, after the event, she was bleeding profusely, and as the shock took on, she bled more and more and more. The mother came in, and in fact, she bled for about 2 weeks and almost died. And the mother was completely upset at what had happened. The girl herself didn't know what was going on, and it was only after about 3-4 weeks that she could actually stand up and carry on with some sort of normality. Now, all these things were forgotten about. She dealt with this, and she lived her life through this until she got to nursing college.
Sorry, Debbie.
Yeah.
I think we're having some breakage.
Oh.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
The sound quality is a little bit.
Is that any better?
I think what we'll do whilst you're checking that out, I think, because we can take a couple of questions thrown to our panels where you can get that sorted. There's been lots of questions coming through the chat box, and one that stands out for me, which I'm going to put to the panelists, and if you don't mind me calling you out and giving you the question to see what the responses are. The first one is about what can social workers do to identify the risks and safeguard potential victims. I know, Lethan, you're the social worker, but I wanted to hear from the ex-police officer. And Jerry, would you mind taking this? And then to Lethan, and whilst Jerry's preparing for his response, what more can faith leaders offer in proactively tackling harmful practice? And this is because you talked about cultural competencies. I know we do find a lot of the time faith abuse happening, but what can faith leaders do? So I'll come to you on that whilst you're preparing. Jerry, are you ready to respond to that question for our attendees?
No, absolutely, and I will keep it very brief. I'll just go back to my presentation about how important it was around frontline professionals recognizing the signs and red flags of the abuse of harmful practices. But as professionals, as social workers, we'll be very tuned into the issues around neglect and abuse, because we see many of the red flags and the signs we see across a whole range of different types of not only harmful practices but other forms of neglect and abuse as well. And of course, fundamentally, in terms of looking at risk, are there other children in that home? Are there other older siblings who might have undergone previously a harmful practice? Because generally speaking, it will be an indicator of future risk to younger siblings as well. So health intelligence and health surveillance in that by social care and policing professionals, I think are really fundamental. But in terms of response, it's got to be linked to preservation of life, the prevention of serious harm and the statutory measures there, allied to what is in the best interests of the child or young person. So the issues around training are really important as well. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Jerry. Great response. And we're going to go to Lethan now. But before you come on, Lethan, I was going to also bring a question around the law to Neelam in terms of international law in protecting victims of harmful practices. I know we've been talking about FGM, child marriage, but I was just thinking about modern day slavery. In countries like Sierra Leone, Guinea, Mali, there's this thing about raising a child as private fostering, or what we call housemaids. It's becoming a huge phenomenon, and I wanted to know if you could touch on the law in terms of child protection in that area. Over to you, Lethan. Would you like to unmute? We still can't hear you.
Oh, okay, you can hear me now. Right, okay, great. So good question. What can faith leaders do? Now, the issue, part of the problem is that when we think about faith leaders, many of them don't have training to become a faith leader. So when it comes to understanding right theology, that becomes very problematic, because I mean, I can set up shop tomorrow to become a faith leader, right within my living room, and be very charismatic and get people to do whatever I want them to do. So the first point is that it's really about with faith leaders having a key understanding of what's the right theology. They can use their influence and their power to influence others. So one of the key things is training and understanding around safeguarding children to begin with. And there are a number of organizations like 318, which is previously called Church's Child Protection Advisory Service. There's another organization called Bethany Project. They do work in sub-Saharan Africa and a number of countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and Nigeria around training pastors, not only around theology, but also safeguarding children. But I think that the key thing is for faith leaders is to understand the power that they have, having a key understanding around safeguarding and being able to direct their congregation and communities beyond their congregation about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. Because I mean, the Church of England, they have a fantastic book that's called around the gospel of safeguarding. So they try to use the Bible and some of the main tenets within the Bible, and to help people to understand why safeguarding children and adults, it's really important. And that's across the board for all different faiths as well. So I think that faith leaders do play a key role also in engaging with statutory services. One of the things as a frontline practitioner, it never even occurred to me about engaging faith groups and faith leaders with the families that I was working with. So it's really about how could we, as frontline practitioners, consult them, and how they can consult us if they have concerns as well, and start to develop that trust.
Thank you so much, Lethan. So important, the role that faith does play in these aspects. I know, Neelam, you're going to come in, but we'll come back to Devi's slide, and I'm happy to just give a brief explanation into sort of the photograph we're all seeing right there. But Neelam, do you want to come in? Because this is a question that's been posed quite a few times in the chat box around the law.
Okay, thank you very much, Alima. I think, you know, you touched upon specifically the modern slavery aspects in Sierra Leone. There's got to be a real desire from that society first to want to change it, because I always go back to the philosophy of law. What is law there to do? Okay, law is there to change behavior, to outline what's unacceptable at a particular point in time, and to bring about change. And we know, for example, in Sierra Leone, if we continue with that example, that there's the United Nations Global Compact, and there are 10 principles guiding business and human rights. And I think that that is really being used to tackle modern slavery through business, where children are being exploited. And but what you are touching upon, this issue regarding children being used as house slaves, that requires a real societal shift. And I think that what I would say is that there's got to be, some of that change has got to come from within the community, and you've got to have the community-driven solutions that Jerry has referred to. And also, you know, if we use the example of how we've brought about change in the UK, we've done it with campaigners and survivors who've experienced, for example, FGM, working with government, working with policy. So it's not just a one size fits all, and there's no easy solution, but we need to work together to bring about that change.
Thank you so much. I don't know if our Devi would like to come in. Are we still having some technical issues?
Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Okay, so if we could sort of, I'll talk about the photograph. In Sierra Leone, there's this tradition, very innocent in it, but it's usually amongst adolescent girls and boys in secondary school, and you want to declare your love to maybe your first love in school. They go and get a knot, and obviously the knot is used, or the chemicals from the knot, to carve this tattoo on yourself. And often people use that, in fact, to hurt each other without the girl or the boy knowing, depending on whoever is trying to declare their love and who's demanding that love. But it can be done in a very vicious way. And I can see here this young lady has got blisters. But again, what could sometimes happen is going to a traditional healer to use herbs to mind or to mend the wound, without going to the hospital. Same with childbirth. Traditional birth attendants, as they call them, usually are also the excisors or the traditional women that carry out the FGM practice itself, will deliver babies. And if you don't go to deliver to the woman who actually carried out your FGM, it's seen as a curse, or she would place a curse on you, and you have to keep going. It's almost like you're indebted to that traditional herbalist or to the traditional excisor, or what we call the sowe. And even in death, when you die and you haven't paid your dues or haven't honored the secret code of that community, your body will be passed on, particularly in Yonibana, which is why it's a chiefdom. That means it has a chief. And wherever we got chiefs, the customs in that community are governed by traditions, and those traditions can be harmful and others cannot be. But it's so important that you talked about the immediate effect. We haven't got much time left, and I don't know if you can come in now quick, Devi.
Can you hear me?
Much better.
Okay, so since we don't have much time, I'll just talk about this little girl's picture here. And she was 8 years old when her grandmother brought her into the hospital. She had been cut when, well, she'd had initiation she went through when she was 5 years old, from while she was staying with the grandmother in the villages. The mother didn't know anything about it, who was in Freetown. Anyway, she brought her into the hospital. She hadn't urinated for about 6 days, and the girl was very, very, very sick, had a lot of temperature and so on. On examination, we found out that the girl had in fact had type 3 FGM performed on her, and she was completely closed up. So she had to have surgery straight away to open up her vagina and so on. And she's, been coming into hospital now. She's about 14 years old and much more happier. Next slide. And again, over here, self-harm, as you were talking about earlier on, Alima, self-harm is there purely because then they don't think that they look good. They want to try and be as miserable looking, try and see if people will not notice them, and so that they won't get picked on, and men won't go near them and things like that. That would go on here. We have our social workers and health professionals address well-being of our patients by running regular workshops and group sessions to support support the meetings at our hospital. Can we have the next slide? As we said here, and also discussions are take place for pathways for patients, as they go on to see what kind of treatment and things that we can offer. But it all has to do a lot with psychological support and a lot of mental health issues that carry on afterwards. We do a lot of work with the communities, and what we've done is we've managed to highlight community champions where we've trained them, and we're working alongside two organizations, obviously yours, Alima, A Girl at a Time, and the other one that we're working through is the Vapina Women's Development Association. The unique thing about the Vapina is that the fact that they work within the Yoni chiefdom, but also it's managed and run by a gentleman who has a teenage daughter and who doesn't believe in any of these things. And having a male person leading an organization like this, it put a lot of emphasis on the fact that it is something that's not only female looked at, but also the men are now thinking about changing the traditions and the cultural belief around this. So I'd just like to say, drop me a line. I know that we had technical issues and I'm sorry you couldn't hear me. If there's any more questions and so on, please do contact me at Better Foundation. As I said earlier on, if anybody needs any support in any way, if you're not a WASFA member and you can't go to their support system, please email us or contact us and we're happy to help you. And there you can see 2 babies delivered. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. And the baby with the colored blanket was in fact delivered by myself on the 8th of May, which was the same day as I had my son, and this was 30 years later. So it was a very, it was a very marked day on that day. I was singing happy birthday to my son early in the morning because I was in Sierra Leone, he was in London. He was 30, and then later on in the day, I delivered a baby on the same day. And again, it was a baby girl, and the mother named her after myself, Devi. So we have lots of Devis there. So please do come and join us. If anybody wants practical experience,
thank you so much, Devi.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I want to take this opportunity to thank our incredible speakers and presenters, Neelam Sakaria, an incredible presentation around the law, and central for me, it's victims' perspective. And to Jerry, thank you so much. That was a brilliant presentation. I like the essence of the community approach to bringing the solution. That is so key to that work. And of course, to Lethan, obviously giving us a greater insight into cultural competencies, why we have to expand our understanding about harmful practices, checking into our own unconscious biasness, how important it is to always have the victim at the center of that. And Devi, of course, your brilliant work at Better Lives Foundation in Sierra Leone. I'm almost indebted to you because you're in my district, and I promise you will work at making things right and getting the message about do no harm to the community, particularly for children, because that's a huge issue in that area. And I want to take the opportunity to thank BASWA and to thank Better Lives Foundation and HIFWA for your incredible work, the Human Value in Action Foundation, for bringing up this incredible webinar. And I want to thank you, the attendees, for making your time to be here. But please feel free to drop questions. There will be lots of information available. Please make sure you check them out and do share your experience that you've had today on social media. We would really like to learn and hear from you all what the experience has been. Have a wonderful day and stay safe and follow the rules. Thank you.
Thank you.